Good to be with everybody again this morning. Like last week, we talked about our series. We started it off with accepting the text, and this week we're talking about accepting miracles. Once again, there is a list of questions in the bulletin. If you don't have a copy, this might be a suitable time to go ahead and grab one if you'd like to follow along that way. Last week we talked about the evidence for the reliability of the text, and one of the illustrations that was given was that the evidence forms an avalanche. And we talked a little bit, just briefly, about how the scientist might say, well, if you could measure all of this out and you could look at all of the snow and the rock falling down upon you, maybe, just maybe, then we could measure how somebody could maybe jump around and dodge all of that. But in reality, we know that's not the case. When an avalanche falls, it falls heavily, and it falls upon the one standing under it. And there's no escape. There's no real escape. And so as we talked last week about the text, this lesson is not so much a sequel as much as I wish that this lesson and then even next week's could have been delivered all at one time, like a continuum, all shoved into just one system. And that's what these three lessons are. They're not set up so much sequentially as much as they work hand in hand. If you accept the text, you accept miracles. If you accept miracles, it's going to be likely you accept the production of the text as being integrous. So what you're starting to see is that you've got evidences that support all of this. And that's what we're trying to go on now this morning with miracles. And one of those major hang-ups then in our world today is that even miracles are extremely doubted. We might say something about believing in God, but do we really believe in miracle? Well, that's what we're examining this morning. Let's talk number one about the explicit claims. As last week, there wasn't that much scripture. We examined a few passages just out of the gate, and then a lot of it was more argumentation, philosophical, logical reasoning. And we start to look at some of this and we start to conclude, we start to deduce, therefore the text is perfectly fine. The text is inspired by God. That's what we concluded last week. If you're not sold on the proposition, give me some time. Let's see if we can wrangle through some more of this and maybe you'll become convinced on it. But if you take a look at the book of John, I want to just run through, I want to shotgun a couple of these passages very quickly, just showing you exactly the claims that are laid out specifically in just the Gospel of John. And we'll stick in that gospel alone. Take a look at John chapter 5, beginning in verse 36. Here's this debate that's going on with the Jews, and they can't really make heads or tails of who Jesus is. But he's going to tell them certain things. He says this in 5:36. But the testimony which I have is greater than the testimony of John. For the works which the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I do, testify about me that the Father has sent me. The claim is therefore very explicit. Jesus is saying the works that I'm doing, the miraculous gifts that I'm manifesting, prove me to be the one sent from the Father. Now to the atheist, to the agnostic, that doesn't amount to much, does it? They say, well, anybody can make those kinds of claims, but how do we know this is legitimate? And we made some of those arguments last week, that if we made the same arguments this week, it would prove these things to be true. If Jesus makes these kinds of claims, and the contemporaries are not seeing him working miracles, this book wouldn't have gotten off the ground, and therefore the miracles had to be true. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, I'm convinced, and I said that last week, I'm convinced we wouldn't even have a Bible before us today. If the miracles were not legitimately happening, how does the text sustain itself for 2,000 years? Turn over a few more pages. Look at this in 10, 37, and 38. This is John once again in 10, 37, and 38, and he's recording the words of Jesus. If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. Now that's a bold claim. This isn't some man who's hoping that everybody would just go ahead and jump on board with what he's saying. This is a man who is so honest, who has so much integrity that he can say to his audience, look, if what I'm doing is not legitimate, then do not follow, do not believe. And he says in 10 and verse 38, he says, but if I do them, though you do not believe me, even though you may not believe the works, so that you may know and understand that the Father is in me, and I in the Father. Turn over a couple of more pages. This is 15:24. John chapter 15 and verse 24. Once more, the book of John is consistently making the claim that Jesus worked signs, miracles, to prove that he was truly who he was claiming to be. And so in 15:24 it says, if I had not done among them the works which no one else did, they would not have sin. But now they have both seen and hated me and my Father as well. Now I'm not going to read the next two passages. I might phrase them to you. But in 20, 30, and 31, we read that last week. And we read 21:25 last week where it says, "These things are written that you might believe that Jesus Christ truly is the Son of God." It says in 21:25 that even, and he's using hyperbole, but John supposed that even the number of miracles that Jesus actually did, we couldn't actually contain them in volumes of books. The books cannot contain all that Jesus did. Imagine if we were to take our pen and paper today and start to write a record just of what we know about Jesus. Most of us are too wordy. We use far too much verbiage in order to keep a very concise record like the New Testament gives us. But the New Testament consistently says that the Christianity that Jesus brought was a miraculous Christianity. Number one, then, your question number one, a miraculous Christianity is the only real Christianity. You take out the supernatural element and what you're left with is something that's not Christianity. Call it whatever you wish, but it's not Christianity. It's not real Christianity. And let me now at this point show you a couple of quotes. This is George Salmon. He says this: "A non-miraculous Christianity is as much a contradiction in terms as a quadrangular circle. When you have taken away the supernatural, what is left behind is not Christianity. It is not the religion which the apostles preached. It is not that into which converts were baptized. It is not that for which martyrs gave their lives." That's a good quote. You take out the supernatural element, you don't have Christianity. You don't have a risen Jesus. You don't have a Jonah in the fish. You don't have a Moses parting the sea. You don't have miracles. And what you're left with is nothing more than secular humanism that simply insists on naturalism throughout history. Now that doesn't offer us much hope. Now this isn't much of an argument as much as it's an observation. You take out miracles, and what we're left with are 100 people roughly here this morning with no hope. What do you have to hang on to? What happens when you're laying on your deathbed? Without miracle, without Christ, without God, there is no hope. And that's a point that Paul's going to make, and we'll read it here in just a moment. Here's one more from Salmon. He says this: "The Christian miracles form a connected system. It is idle to reject one unless you reject the whole." Catch that. That's a really good point. If you reject one miracle just because you say, "I don't believe in miracles per se," you reject the whole. But he goes on and he says, "If one be admitted, then all of the rest, if they're credible, are credible. If, for instance, it be not denied that Jesus rose from the dead, it is but time wasted to attempt to show that the story of the miraculous conception, virgin birth, is later in date. If in his death he was not subject to the ordinary laws of mortality, it is quite as likely as not that he differed from other men in his birth." Now some of that gets a little bit thorny to follow along with, but here's Salmon's point. If you start to deny miracle, you deny them all. You can't deny miracles and say, well, Jesus didn't really raise from the grave, we don't really know about the origin of the universe, deny miracles, and then say, but we could accept a few over here. Why would you do that? But similarly, you can't have people that are rejecting miracles in the biblical text. Well, I don't really believe in the Red Sea and it being split. I don't really believe in Jonah being swallowed by the fish. I don't really believe that Jesus really healed that man. And then go ahead and say, but let me tell you one miracle I do believe is that Jesus came out of the tomb. Now, I don't know if you followed the biblical field much, but over the past 200 years, let me tell you what is now popular. And it was popularized mainly by two guys named DeWitt, and then the other one's Julius Wellhausen. Almost slipped my memory. Julius Wellhausen and DeWitt really started to form this opinion, and here's what it was. No miracles in the Bible really happened except for the resurrection of Christ. Now, whatever you make of that, we've got to at least say that's not consistent. If you're going to reject all of the other miracles because you don't believe in miracles, reject the resurrection of Christ. But if you're going to accept the resurrection of Christ, how much more might be on the table? How possible would it be then that God could speak the universe into existence? How possible would it be that he could split the sea? And that sort of thing. Salmon's exactly right. Here's one more. This is Gresham Machen. He was a professor at old Princeton Theological Seminary, later then Westminster Theological. And here's what he said. In one sense, miracles, this is one of your blanks, miracles are an hindrance to faith. But who ever thought to the contrary? And he says this: it may be certainly admitted that if the New Testament had no miracles in it, it would be far easier to believe. Of that we're certain. But the trouble is, would it be worth believing? What would you have if you took the miracles out of the text, out of our world, and you say they didn't really happen? Sure, you might be able to convince your colleagues. Yeah, oh, he believes in Christianity now. Well, with no miracles, that's great. But is it worth anything? What are we holding on to? Do you really have any hope beyond this life? Now, these quotes are good. Machen's good, Salmon's good, but here's one that's probably better, and that's the Apostle Paul. Look at it in 1 Corinthians 15. I want to read this one with you. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, beginning about let's start in about verse 14. He's talking about the resurrection of the body, the apostle is, and he says this in 15:14. Well, we need to back up, don't we? We need to start in 12. 15:12. Now, if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, 15:12, how do some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? Catch that. Some of these people at Corinth were saying that Jesus was their Savior, had come out of the tomb, while at the same time saying there's no such thing as raising from the grave. That's a contradiction. Well, he says this in 15:13. But if there be no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ then has been raised. There's their problem. Now look at this in 15:14, and you've got some blanks here to follow along. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is vain. That's your first blank on number 3. The preaching would be vain. He goes further. Verse 14, and if our preaching is vain, your faith is also vain. Faith is your next blank. No purpose in being a Christian. No purpose in preaching. He's going to make the point at one point in this chapter. He's going to say, no purpose in suffering. Why would the apostles be out on the battle lines every day giving their lives if people don't really come out of the tomb? And he says this, furthermore, 15:15. Moreover, we're even found to be false witnesses of God, because we testified against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are really not raised. Now 16. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ then could be raised. He reiterates his argument. But here he goes further in 17. Here's another thing that's in vain. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. And all of us, folks, we're all still in our sins. Who else do you appeal to take care of your sin problem? If Jesus didn't come out of the tomb, we have nobody. We have absolutely nobody. So it won't do to simply deny the fact of miracle and to simply say, well, miracles don't occur, and then to offer us Christians nothing in exchange. I need something to give me purpose in life. We talked about some of those things last week, didn't we? We talked about how the text provides us with purpose. It's God communicating to us. And to think that God wouldn't then raise Jesus leaves us with nothing. It leaves us with what Bertrand Russell did say, a philosophy that leads to nothing more than just dark depression. That's all we would have is secular humanism, atheism. No God, no purpose. No, we have somebody that deals with our sin problem. So says 17. Look at this in 18. He goes further. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. Okay, let's ask this question of ourselves. What about our dead loved ones? What about them, folks? How many of you have a dead grandmother? Dead mother? A dead son or daughter? And to think then that we would buy into a philosophy who offers us nothing for those loved ones gone on. Folks, now I know that's an emotional appeal, but it's a good one. And here's the point. Let me speak to you a little bit personally just for the moment. My grandfather, a week and a half ago, went in to have heart surgery, triple bypass surgery. Things came out okay. Last night, he ends up falling, and his pulse drops below 30. And so here's a man that could be on his deathbed. We don't know. But let's say he does. Because even if he lives through all of this and things come out okay, you're looking about 10, 20 years in the future. He's, I think, 76, 77 right now. He's going to die. Here's a man that's going to die. I've got a child. At some point, it could be the case that Spencer goes on before me. And how do we account for the dead loved ones if not for Christianity? What's driving us? What's really there to offer us any kind of real peace, real hope? The deathbed doesn't look good to the non-believer, am I right? It doesn't. It doesn't look good. There's nothing tangible to hold on to. There's no hope. There's no substance. If you take away miracles, you've got nothing. And that's Paul's point. He says this in 15:19. He says, if we have hoped in Christ in this life only, We are of all men to be most pitied. And there's the last blank. Our hope would be in vain, 15:19. 3, the last blank, would be hope is in vain. Here's the point, folks. You go to church every Sunday. You drop a $100 bill into the collection plate. You do good unto your neighbor. You would rather buy a new TV, but instead you give money to the homeless. These are the kinds of things you're actively engaged in. And to think that we do all of this selflessness for no gain. If we as Christians are doing all of this and there is no God and there is no miracle breaking into our world, we are of all men most pitiable. That's what Paul says. We're doing it for the wrong reasons. If this is the only life we have, this is the only existence we have, then let's be selfish and only do things for number one. But that's not the point. Miracles do exist. Salmon's good. Machen's good. Paul might be better. Everything about us, everything about Christianity would be in vain. Okay, let's move forward. Number 2, let's talk about the evidences then for historical miracles. I could have documented hundreds of quotes from David Hume where he says, well, my experience doesn't allow me to believe in miracles. He says that I've never seen miracles, experience again. He says based on rationality, it's not rational to believe in miracles. Okay, maybe not. But let's think about some of this. The fact of our universe, and that it even exists, is perhaps the most basest of all arguments that miracles at some point had to occur. How did our world get here? How did we start out as a human race? How did we become? What is our origin story? And I'm saying that the Bible gives us something to chew on. It gives us something substantive. But outside of the Bible, I don't know another philosophy that offers us anything that's real or substantive. Is there any real alternative? I don't know of one. Now let me show you a couple of quotes. This is George Wald. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a professor at Harvard, scientist. Let me show you what he said. One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task, evolution of primeval life from inorganics. I'll tell you what he's talking about here in just a second. To concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Spontaneous generation. Let me tell you what that is before I read the rest of the quote. Spontaneous generation is life from non-life. It violates the law of biogenesis. Biogenesis suggests that life has to come from life. So what I believe in, what you believe in, is that there is a life, there is a living being that exists outside of time, space, and matter, and has therefore intruded into the world of time, space, and matter, our human dimension, to create life. Life, God, who exists outside of our realm, creates life. George Wald says it comes from non-life. And he even recognizes this is impossible. Life cannot come from non-life, yet catch the rest of the quote. He says this, yet here we are, and as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. Do you catch how odd that is? Imagine if I were to tell you it's impossible for a man to come out of a tomb, but here I am as a Christian. Wouldn't grab us with much, would it? Let me go further. Well, let me actually tell you about these two other guys. Henry Morowitz, famous thermodynamicist, and then J.D. Bernal of the University of London, both had similar things to say, like Wald did. Life can't come from non-life, yet here we are. Now here's the question I want us to raise. If the professionals in the field, the scientists, the biochemists, the physicists, the thermodynamicists, if all of these professionals in the field are this bad, like Wald and Morowitz and Bernal, maybe we ought to go back to Genesis 1, Exodus chapter 20, and realize that maybe Moses isn't so bad after all. Maybe it could be the case that, any of you heard the word ex nihilo, ex nihilo? Out of nothing, Latin, it's a Latin phrase. That's what we believe in. We believe that God could create everything that we see around us by speaking it into existence. And there are passages all throughout the Old Testament that say that is exactly how he did it. What's your first passage of your Bible say? In the beginning, God. In the beginning, some kind of being outside of time, space, and matter intruded into our world and created ours. And created our world, created our universe, created our system, created who we are. And then we think about all of these professionals who start to say, well, it's impossible to get life from non-life, yet here we believe it. Maybe Moses isn't so bad. Maybe we do believe in a creator after all. Okay, let's go a little bit further. It should be recognized that miracles cannot be disproved. Catch this point. If you are a philosopher, if you are a scientist, if you are an historian, you can pick any field you want. If miracles are things that defy the laws of nature, they supersede the laws of nature, then how would you, as a scientist, recreate that in some kind of confines where you can actually test whether or not miracles can be duplicated? You cannot. As an historian, how would you disprove miracles? As an historian, how would you disprove something in the past that has happened? You cannot. And the point I'm seeking to make is that all of these guys try to go at it by saying, I might talk about some of these in the future of the lesson, they might say, well, it's irrational, or it violates human thought, or it violates our experience. But those aren't arguments. Miracles cannot be disproven. And so here's one of your blanks. If you put on number 4, what we believe is that miracles are a source, they stem from divine revelation. They come from divine revelation. These things cannot disprove. Science, history, philosophy cannot disprove miracles. You cannot disprove that the flood happened. You may doubt it. You may feel like there's not enough evidence to prove that it happened, but you can't disprove it. And that's what we're going at with the miracles of the Bible. They are a matter of divine or special revelation. So here's my point. Here's my point to try to sum up some of this, and I know this is a little bit thorny, but let me try to sum up what I'm going at. If I wanted to disprove today that Jonah wasn't really swallowed by a fish, how would I even begin to attempt that? If I wanted to prove to you today that Jesus didn't really come out of the tomb, how would I even begin to attempt that? You see, the point I'm making is that miracles, we can doubt them, but there's not a way to disprove them. The Bible claims them. And if we can prove the text to be legitimate, then God has revealed them through a divinely inspired text that miracles are a thing we ought to believe in. The Bible makes the claim, if God's text is legitimate, miracles are on the table. If miracles are on the table, the text might be legitimate from God. So you see how both are going hand in hand? I know that's a little bit tough to follow. That's why I'm trying to say I wish I could have delivered all 3 of these lessons at one time and just shoved them into your hands. It doesn't work like that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Last week, actual miracles. We talked about some of these, 2 of these 4 arguments we talked about. Here are 4 that I want to give you. 2 of them we talked about last week. 2 are new. The first one is a new one. Actual miracles are the only explanation for the origin of the universe. That's 5. That's number 5A, existence of the universe. How else would you explain how we got here? Moses gives us the clue. The Old Testament gives us the answer. Jesus in the New Testament picks up on it and calls it the beginning in Matthew chapter 19. How else would we explain it? Spontaneous generation? We can't buy into that, folks. It doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even make sense that life would come from non-life. Number 2, we talked about this one last week. The apostolic change and suffering. How else would we account for the apostles changing from Luke 24, where they say, we're not so sure about Jesus coming out of the tomb. Next day later, after they've seen him, they're ready to preach the gospel and yet even die for the same testimony. How do we explain that? Number 3, the existence of New Testament Christianity. We read a quote last week where we talked about to believe in Christians, then dreaming up the miracles, would have the superstructure before we've even gotten the foundation. How do you account for the existence of the New Testament church if the miracles would have been required to get the New Testament church off the ground? And then number 4, I'll read a quote to you here in just a moment about Judas' betrayal. If the miracles didn't happen, think about Judas' betrayal. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Let me read a couple of quotes. This is a long one. This is a long quote, but it's going to summarize some of those points we just read. This is George Hill. The history of mankind has not preserved a testimony so complete, so satisfactory as that which I have now started. He's talking about the gospel record. If in conformity to the exhibitions which these writings give of their character, you suppose their testimony to be true, then you can give the most natural account of every part of their conduct, their conversion, their steadfastness, their heroism. But if notwithstanding every appearance of truth, you suppose their testimony, he's talking about the apostles, to be false, inexplicable circumstances of glaring absurdity crowd upon you. You must suppose that 12 men of just average birth, mean birth, of no education, living in that humble station which placed ambitious views out of their reach and far from their thoughts. These men were not elitists. They were not scholars. They were people like you and me. And he goes on and he says, if you suppose that they were that kind of person, like the biblical text says, and they were without any aid from the state, they formed the noblest scheme that ever entered into the mind of man. They adopted the most daring means of executing that scheme, and conducted it with such address as to conceal the imposture under the semblance of simplicity and virtue. You must suppose that men guilty of blasphemy and falsehood, united in an attempt the best contrived, and which has in fact proved the most successful for making the world virtuous. Catch that. Here are men who are liars, working up some wonderful scheme that in result gives the world a religion of peace and nobility. Odd. Let's go further. Hill says, that they formed this singular enterprise without seeking any advantage to themselves, with an avowed contempt of honor and profit, and with the certain expectation of scorn and persecution, that although conscious of one another's villainy, here's Peter knowing that Paul's a fraud, here's Paul knowing that Thomas is a fraud, here's Thomas knowing that Matthew's a fraud, and all of the apostles know each other are fraudulent, none of them ever thought of providing for his own security, money, by disclosing the fraud. Not a one comes out and says, oh, everything we've been teaching is bunk. And he says this, but that amid sufferings the most grievous to flesh and blood, the apostles preserved in their conspiracy to cheat the world into piety, honesty, and benevolence. Truly they who can swallow such suppositions have no title object to miracles. Do you catch the point? Folks, the only explanation for the apostles' change in testimony is miracle. Legitimate miracle. Maybe Jesus did really come out of the grave. Let me show you about Judas's betrayal. This is from Bernard Ram. He says, consider the case of Judas Iscariot. Judas betrays Jesus. And what does he do? He gets the 30 pieces of silver, right? Shows them in the garden. And look at what Ram points out. He says, when he went to betray Jesus Christ, what could have been more damaging than the first-hand evidence that the miracles of Jesus were fakes, or impostures or tricks? On this score, the mouth of Judas is sealed. All he can do is tell the Jews where Jesus prayed. Here's a man that if he's going to betray Jesus, wouldn't it have been much better to say, I can show you that everything he's been working is fraudulent? He doesn't do that. He says, let me tell you where he prays to the Father. Takes him to the Garden of Gethsemane. Let's go a little bit further. G.E. Ladd, I know I'm reading a lot of quotes. This is interesting stuff to me. Maybe some of you are saying, man, this is a bore. But this is very interesting to me. It really seems like this strengthens our faith. And it shows that the naturalism, the humanism, is coming out even in our Bible professors. We've got Bible professors, not just Church of Christ professors, all over this country. And let me show you exactly what they're teaching. This is George E. Ladd. He was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. And I want to show you what he had to say about the resurrection of Jesus. He said this, the historian, as a historian, this is a Bible professor, a Baptist preacher. He's dead now. This is a Baptist preacher. Watch this. The historian, as a historian, can establish certain facts. Well, that's good to know. Jesus was really dead and buried. His followers were crushed in despair. Suddenly, and for the historian, inexplicably, their despair was transformed into radiant confidence in Jesus' resurrection. They were certain they had met Jesus, alive from the dead, and the entombed body of Jesus disappeared. The historian must also admit that historical criticism, catch this, historians have not yet found an adequate historical explanation for these facts. And that for the historian, the transformation in the apostles, the disciples, is an unsolved problem. Really? We haven't figured out what changed the apostles, what got the New Testament church off the ground, how they share the same testimony. We haven't figured it out? No, I think McGuigan's right. McGuigan says this, it's a perverse man indeed, who grants all of this and then denies the explicit explanation given by the people, the apostles, who were involved in this. Here the apostles are saying, well, we can tell you how all of this is explained. Jesus came out of the tomb. And the historian says, well, we know, catch what he knows. He knows Jesus died and he knows Jesus was buried. But he doesn't know Jesus resurrected. On what basis does he know that Jesus died and was buried? New Testament testimony. On what basis would we as Christians know factually that Jesus came out of the tomb? Same basis. Lad has no room to tell us about the death and burial of Jesus unless he can also tell us about the resurrection. And folks, that's the crux of the matter. What we're getting to is a generation, I think I said this a couple of weeks ago, we're getting to a generation who is so intelligent, we're so rational, we know everything. Google has answered everything for us, that we're too wise now to accept the multiplication tables. That's where we're headed with our society. We know everything so well that we're so sophisticated that we reject 2 times 2 equals 4. How bizarre. That's not an original quote. That's G.K. Chesterton. He said that about 80 years ago. Let's go a little bit further. Let's talk about the criteria of the miracles of the Bible. I'm going to really rifle through some of this. I know I'm going long. I know I did last week, and I'm telling you I'm going to next week. Come prepared. Elders will make an exception. Bring your donuts and your coffee. This is a joke. Okay. Let me just show you the criteria of the miracles. Last week we talked about the text, and we talked about all of those criteria. What would we expect if God did write to us? What would we expect miracles to look like if they did happen? Number 1, they'd be in the thousands, not just few. Jesus fed how many with the loaves and the fishes? Well, on one count, he fed 4,000 men. On another count, 5,000. You can read some of that in Matthew 14 and 15, I believe it is. Thousands. Not little instances behind closed doors. Thousands. Number 2, they happened over periods of time. This wasn't just a one-time event where people said, well, I wish we could have been there to see Jesus work a miracle. We missed it. They were happening consistently in his ministry. Number 3, they were public, not hidden or staged. This wasn't some setup. Number 4, they were spontaneous. In John 2, he goes to a wedding feast not for the purpose of anything but recreation. Read the text. Jesus goes just to go to the wedding. And his mama comes to him and says, we are out of the, I'm sure he's talking about grape juice, same Greek word for grape juice as it is for alcoholic beverage. I'm sure it's grape juice. Jesus changes it there on the spot. Spontaneous. He didn't need his rig that he pulled in on some trailer so that he could then get the right setup to work a miracle. It was spontaneous. Number 5, there was a variety of kinds. How about this one? He shoves some demons into the swine. He pulls a coin out of the fish's mouth. He comes out of a tomb. You see, he doesn't just have his one specialized miracle that he works. Jesus is all over the place. You come to our VBS and we'll teach you about a lot of them. That's happening in June. Okay, in June, VBS, Miracles of Jesus. Come to it. Number 6, never overcome by the enemies. Anybody really reject the miracles of Jesus? Not that we know of. Not in the text, not out of the text. Number 7, it was fitting to Jesus' reputation. Here's a man claiming to be God in the flesh. What would we expect out of such a man? We would expect him to work miracles. Number 8, these are the things that are integral or core to Christianity. That's what we would expect miracles to be if they really happened. We would expect it to be the core of New Testament Christianity. And what do we have at the base of our faith? The resurrection. Number 9, they wouldn't be silly or cheap. There's one apocryphal source where it has Jesus as a little boy smiting his buddy dead because he was jealous. It has Jesus creating clay birds and making them come to life. This is nonsense. That's not what we read of in the Bible. These miracles are not silly or cheap. These are things that we would expect from a God in the flesh. Here's number 10, not sensationalist. He's not doing this for entertainment purposes. Number 11, it wouldn't be for money or selfish gain. Not a one time do you see an apostle or Jesus Christ himself doing what they're doing in order to make money. Number 12, not requiring one's faith. I like that one from the Pentecostals. They tell us that miracles always require the faith of the one doing it. Well, that's odd. Jesus is out walking on water. I wonder where the faith is. You see the point? Jesus can work something even on something that's not an animate object. It doesn't require faith of the water for the miracle to be performed. It didn't require the tomb to have some special significance. Jesus can work a miracle in and without the faith of an individual. And that's the kind of thing we would expect from a God in the flesh. Nothing like the miracles today. Number 13, they would be purposeful. I know I'm out of time, so I'll just tell you. Acts 2:22 says that Jesus of Nazareth was a man approved of God with signs and miracles and wonders. This is the kind of thing that we would expect if miracles were real. Now, let me tell you about some of the objections. I'm going to have to rifle through all of this as well. Somebody might say, well, the people were gullible. People were just eager to believe anything and everything. Well, maybe so, but let me show you what the text says. I've picked a scattering of texts. John came, Jesus said, and you believed him not. Here's another strand. You will not believe. Another one. Except you see the signs, you will not believe. John 4:48. Oh, fools and slow to believe. Luke 24:25. The point that's being made is these people were not gullible people, unlike us, the rationalists. They were just like you and me, and they doubted things. They had their objections. Well, miracles violate our experience and human reason. Well, that's not an argument. Not an argument at all. Well, even one miracle would open a can of worms. Well, not really. Not really. I mean, you would accept the Bible miracles, but you wouldn't have to believe everything that some street preacher says. Next objection. Maybe the record's bad or corrupt. Last week, if you weren't here last week, watch the lesson from last week. The record's not corrupt, folks. The record's intact. The record's inspired. The record's infallible. What about this one? Improbable. No, what's improbable would be 12 men having the same hallucination or teaching the same message, and they would be suffering for something that's not true, or that they stole the body and they've got the body of Jesus, but they're not giving it up and they're dying for this without personal gain. That's improbable. And then miracles aren't happening today. Here are your last 4 blanks. Let me give these to you. Somebody says, miracles are then happening today. Well, I'm convinced that the text in 1 Corinthians 13:8 says that those things were of a transient nature. These things were designed to pass away. They were like scaffolding. Once you get the house finished, they come down. But here's the 4 points I want to leave you with if you're thinking about modern miracles. Number 1, seek natural explanations. I don't think you would have been wrong in the first century if Jesus is out doing some miracle to look for the natural explanation as to how it could happen. Look, even if you're a doubter, Jesus is going to give you enough evidence in the first century to convince you miracles are happening. You won't be able to deny some of this or find a natural explanation for Jesus' miracles. Number 2, define closely what miracle is. We're not talking about childbirth. We're not talking about somebody living through a car accident that was rather rough. We're talking about something that would defy the laws of nature. It would demand a God stepping in and beyond, an intrusion into the world of time, space, and matter. Number 3, be suspicious. Here's a big one for us today. Be suspicious of money or entertainment, showmanship, or purpose. Don't just buy into miracles today, folks. Be hesitant, be cautious, seek evidence, seek proof. And number 4, I think we really need to note these differences and some of those 13 points I gave you as how they differ from miracles in the text as to what are being said today. Now, here's my number 1 argument as we close. You might have questions on all of this. Reach out if you do. But I want to close with this one point. If we accept last week's lesson that the text is an inspired record, and if we accept that the universe did get here somehow, and if we accept that there's no other alternative than Jesus Christ is taking away sin and giving us hope, my question would be, what other reasons would there be for doubting miracles? What reasons are there? If the text is inspired and it's the only philosophy that makes sense, the text is inspired, it's credible, and it's giving us some kind of record that legitimately says Jesus did work these miracles, and we can't disprove the record, the matter is one of divine revelation, and Jesus is saying we have full confidence in the record, and therefore, even though we haven't experienced miracles, we have full confidence in the one who can offer salvation. Let's close with this question. As we leave here this morning, what confidence do you have that if we were to die in a car wreck as we leave, what confidence would you have that you've got a home in heaven with Christ? Folks, I don't know any other means of confidence than by divine revelation. And here's the point. The only reason I know that if we leave and we can go to heaven, I know is that the text is inspired, and because God is legitimate, He has spoken. He's given us His word, He's trustworthy. And so when we find the character, we find God who's given us so much, and He promises so much, if we know that His record is inspired, then everything else comes with it. This morning, if you're not one of His, find hope, find faith in Christ. By believing in Him as the risen Lord, John 8:24, by confessing Him as such, Matthew 10:32, by repenting of a past wicked way of life, Acts 17:30 and 31, and by being baptized into that blood where saving